Well, hello all, and welcome to this very exciting Civilizations in Review. We're here with Tanner Wright to chat about the Zand Dynasty, along with Sarah, our fellow Z Empire writer and co-interview today. I'm very excited to jump into the Zands. They are the most modern empire, dynasty, civilization that we have on our site as of now. So excited to learn the very recent history that they went through. You are listening to us live on Facebook, so thanks for joining us. We are also going to cross-post this on our website, our Spotify, our Instagram, and our YouTube, so you can learn all the great things we're about to jump into. And of course, follow along on our website at the Zand Empire under the Civilizations 101 section. So welcome all. Thanks so much. I'm going to throw it to Sarah to read the one-on-one word intro, and we'll get started.
Thank you. The rise to power of the Zand dynasty ushered in a desperately needed respite from 40 years of war, which had preceded its rule. The prolonged peace allowed for the flourishing of agriculture, the restructuring of financial systems, and the opening of international trade. Initially ruling over southern Iran, the Zand dynasty eventually came to encompass large swaths of Asia, including most of modern-day Iran, as well as parts of modern Iraq, Bahrain, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. With an eye towards opening trade between Persia and the rest of the world, the Zands officially began trading with Great Britain in 1779.
Wonderful. It's kind of weird to see 1779 when most of these empires are 4000 BCE. Is that why you chose this empire, Tanner? Because of their more modern aspects, or were you just interested in the Z end of the alphabet situation?
I think a little bit of both.
Go ahead.
I was interested in a Persian civilization particularly, but I think the recent nature of the empire made it appealing and more interesting when I was researching. A lot of the things that have gone on with them are super recent, like trading with the British East India Company and things like that. They're things that we kind of think about when we think of more modern history.
Yeah, I guess one thing that I was kind of noticing about the more modern was mine personally was like 1,000 years before yours, and I knew I had a lot of trouble finding information. Did you have any sort of issues like that, or was there pretty readily available information?
There was some pretty readily available information. I think that the big thing with the Zans is that they only lasted 50 years. And so the amount of information, there are several sources that cover like very basic information, but you had to do a little digging for some of the other things like their impact on art and architecture. There are some like Iranian websites that focus on architecture that I was able to find. But yeah, I think that it was pretty easy to find people who had looked at it, but maybe not dug so deep into it because it was such a relatively short lasting empire.
What's I think really fascinating about the Zands and most of the Persian empires is they're geographically pretty aligned. I would say a lot of these other empires are very amorphous in sort of the land that they had, and obviously each empire has its own space. But the Zands, the empire after it, the empire before it, and before it, and before it, to the thousands of years before, all were pretty much just Iran and maybe a couple bordering places.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know. That's not really a question. I just find that really interesting that the history of Iran is very much segmented, and so this is the Zand section. I guess did you sort of notice that in your research of the empires before and after the Zand as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the Zand started out mostly over southern Iran and a lot of the agricultural parts of Iran, which influenced a lot of their policies later. But it seemed that as the Zand dynasty sort of gained power, they were able to spread out a bit more, and they took over. One of the big things was they took over the port of Basra in modern day southern Iraq. But they did stay true pretty much to their geographical territory. They didn't really spread out a ton. I think everywhere that they took over still has a modern day border with Iran in some way or another. So they really didn't expand tremendously over Asia.
Yeah, and one other thing, like kind of at their inception, I noticed that their first leader called himself an advocate, and so did some of the later leaders. Is that anything that kind of stuck around, or is that kind of mark a big shift from past history and then future?
It definitely marked a big shift from the past. They were the first one to not refer to themselves as, I would butcher the Persian name, but it means King of Kings. I think it's the Shah, but they were the first empire to not use that title and to instead use the word vakil, like advocate of the people. And while they didn't necessarily usher in democracy per se, I guess they were more bringing in the idea that a leader should be a representative of the people. And I think that sort of thought process did continue and follow their dynasty. But I think, I don't quote me on this, but I believe that the Qajars after them continued to use the King of Kings title. But I think that the idea was sort of instilled in the Iranian population after that, that there is, started to develop a culture that leaders should be representatives of the people that they're serving.
And I think there's probably a tradition in maybe modern government of Iran or just, other countries around with that sort of mentality. Maybe not in practice, definitely not in practice, but at least the mentality is connected. Mm-hmm. The Qajar dynasty is the only other dynasty that is the most modern on our website, which is done and will be a future live stream. So check in with us later, our listeners. But I'm reading through it now as you're talking, and they do go back to the Shahasana, or King of Kings, the Shah, meaning king, that you may have heard of before in Persian communities. Anyways, that's a fascinating point in terms of sort of their perspective on governance and ruling and, the 50 years that they were around, what they did in those, 2 generations or so. Do you have more sort of fascination, background, interest in your research of the sort of ruling system that the Zands did?
In terms of the ruling system, I think that was the most interesting, because I think other than that, a lot of what they did was, because they were primarily originated in an agricultural province. I read a lot that they restructured the tax system to sort of take the burden off of farmers and more onto more urban areas. And so I think that helped agriculture flourish a lot, which probably also influenced the other big thing that they are sort of known for, which is opening trade with Great Britain. They're one of the first Iranian empires to engage extensively with trade with Europe. And they traded particularly with the British East India Company. I think it just says Great Britain on the Zand 101 that I wrote, but I think that later I realized that they were trading specifically with Britain in India. But that was a really big thing for them, was the opening of international trade. And then, like I said earlier, when they captured the port of Basra, that was even though they didn't necessarily, their dynasty didn't live to see that come to fruition, how much of a huge deal for trade that the port of Basra would be. The fact that they captured that and started to use it as a port of trade, which, Basra continues today to be a major trade port in global commerce. So, yeah.
The trade is so interesting to me, especially with Great Britain. Was there any other sort of colonial trade with other colonial powers, or did they really just stick to the East India Company? I guess that's just so fast. I feel like we rarely see that kind of even trade. I guess my other question is kind of, was it an even-sided trade, or do you know, or was it kind of a colonial exploitation?
Oh, I wouldn't want to venture a guess onto that. I don't know how even the trade was between the Zands and the British East India Company, but I know that they exported a lot of agricultural products. And so, to some extent, it did benefit the Zands. I did not come across anything in my research that they were trading with other colonial empires. I think it kind of makes sense that they would have been trading with India, given the geographical position and the fact that most of their trade was flowing through Basra. But yeah, that was the main thing that they in terms of international trading partners. I think that there was probably some trade with other regional powers, but I don't know that was a marked difference from previous dynasties.
It's just so fascinating too. As we chat, this is the 30th Civilizations in Review, and there's 50 plus on our website to explore. Trade always was a place to engage with other. I guess the Great British Empire is an empire, but in terms of geographic land masses or within the same region, but to so globalize, I guess. Mm-hmm. I know some empires have done the whole Silk Road and through China, which is also quite impressive given the lack of easy travel and trade, but the connection to Great Britain, I think, is really fascinating here, because that also means India. Mm-hmm. I see why it was such a big point of your article. I think it's really crucial in the 1700s. as the United States was first being founded on top of, all of these pieces of world history. The Zand's probably not a big, flag of that component, but at least still within the British realm to have a successful trading partner that undoubtedly the Qajars, the empire after Zand, continued. Is very fascinating. I don't really have more questions about trade. I wanted to sort of highlight that. And you do mention the East India Company in your econ section, so don't worry. Don't doubt yourself. You did it correctly.
Okay, good. Just wanted to
The 101 intro is the intro to the whole thing, so you're all set. No, but again, I just think that's really fascinating. Trade, really, it's trade and or like battles are the two ways empires have survived. 40 years is relatively short, but still that's a chunk of time. And trade is clearly what the Zands prioritized, which is an interesting sort of focus. Taking the lessons of all the empires before them and whatnot. I really want to talk more about Basra if you have any more info on them. That is such a huge port city today, and for them to have basically begun that path and process and connection point, I think is huge. If you have more background, I'd love to chat more.
Yeah, definitely. Let me pull up my notes because I have some notes on Basra. And the reconciliation. Yeah, so I think Basra was a big. It also helped. Capturing the port of Basra also helped them expand a big port of their own in modern day Iran, which is I think it's Bushehr. But they're capturing of Basra during their period of expansion because they weren't sort of constantly expanding. It was as though like they expanded in the beginning, and then sort of were able to consolidate what they had and then use that to trade. But I think that the major port of Basra that had already kind of been used for trade and continues to be used for trade just because of its strategic location was a big reason that they developed the port of Bushehr in southern Iran that presumably they continued to use after Persia lost control of Basra and it became part of modern Iraq.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to hear you talk about kind of their expansion and capturing the port. Would you talk a little bit more about kind of what their allies and rivals looked like? I know in your article you had mentioned that they had very few regional allies. And I kind of was, and also you mentioned it was a time of peace. Was it also a time that they were getting attacked by outsiders, or was it just overall relatively peaceful?
They were really born out of decades of civil war, and so the fact that the Zands were able to sort of consolidate power in their region of Iran was a huge deal, and really was what marked their empire was that they were able to stamp out internal conflict by establishing themselves as the legitimate rulers of initially their portion of Iran and later larger Iran and parts of Asia and the Middle East. The Qajars were sort of a consistent thorn in their side and eventually overtook them. And then they seemed to bump into the Ottomans a bit when they expanded into Mesopotamia. But like I said, I think that was really sort of the focal point of what made them a memorable empire, or one of the focal points that made them a memorable empire and allowed them to come to power was their ability to sort of stamp out the internal conflict that had plagued that area for so long beforehand.
Did they have any other kind of internal policies outside of the tax restructuring that like made it kind of more ideal to live there, or is it just the more peaceful and then the tax restructuring?
I know that there were a number of different ways that they focused on developing agriculture and helping agriculture flourish, and I think that a big thing was sort of taking the focus away from being like an urban center dominated society into one that is sort of more generally structured around sort of equitable practices between people who live in agriculture producing areas or the countryside and those that lived in like major urban centers. It's really interesting because obviously most of the trade is going to come from big urban centers, and that's one of the things that they're known for, but they were able to do that by sort of restructuring society, whether that be through taxes or just governmental incentives to produce more agriculturally.
That's so interesting. It still feels very relevant, I guess, in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating too because a lot of things we're talking about, like you can very clearly see the modern influence. I'm assuming that was a little bit easier of a section to write for you, especially when 4,000 years ago, that's just not the technology we use at all anymore. Um, I guess let me ask that: was it relatively easier to write some of these sections? I mean, I know short period of history, but at least only 400 years ago.
It was a little bit, it wasn't terribly difficult to write, but I will say that it was kind of difficult to follow all of the number of Zands that, like the trying to piece together all the Zand leaders that died in sort of the end of their dynasty. They went through a lot really quick, and it was kind of hard to piece together when exactly the dynasty fell. So I would say the decline was an interesting part because it sort of faded off, and then they were eventually completely overtaken by the Qajars. Um, but yeah, I would say that overall it wasn't particularly difficult to write. I think, like I said earlier, the section about the like modern images where I talk about Shiraz, that took a lot more digging. Um, but overall, it was pretty easy to write.
Love it. That makes me happy to hear. What I find really fascinating about this empire, and you kind of touched on it often, it is this like dramatic shift from the Safavids, which was the empire right before, known for their brutality and conflict, to then turn that to a trading, agricultural, flourishing hub that, in essence, is now modern day Iran. I mean, that is kind of the connecting bridge is the Zands, and the Qajars right after them. Yeah, I just find that a really interesting sort of like end piece, or not even that, a connection point is a better word, of Iranian history. So thank you for adding to the timeline of modern Iran with this article. Yeah, I mean, the connection to Great Britain is fascinating. It's sort of pushback against the Ottomans is interesting, and obviously underfalling the Qajars is as well. With all of those pieces, are any sort of other components, aspects, research you came across that you found interesting?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things that I came across is actually sort of the story behind Shiraz turning into such a hub of art and architecture, and the history of Shiraz I found really interesting. So the Zands are the first ones, I believe the first ones, or at least the first ones in any dynasty near them, in terms of history, to move their capital to Shiraz, and they left a lot of impact there. But an interesting thing is the title of the main bazaar today in Shiraz is called the Vakil Bazaar, which many people trace back to the Zands, but there is a lot of controversy about that. I actually sort of ended up down a rabbit hole of whether or not the Vakil Bazaar was actually named that during the Zand dynasty, or whether it was named that later, or whether it was named that immediately following the fall of the Zand dynasty as like a joke, making fun of the Zand rulers, as whether or not it was like a sarcastic title. So I'm not going to lay out my opinion on that because scholars much more dedicated to that topic than myself do not agree. But I thought that that was a really interesting thing. That's like a hotly debated topic, is whether or not where the Vakil Bazaar came from, and whether or not it's really like genuine appreciation of that name.
Try not to get hate comments. Yeah, I guess kind of one thing on that note, on that kind of idea of like the bazaar and just kind of their flourishing of culture, do you mind talking a little bit more? You mentioned the art and architecture, and that's something I always find super interesting, especially in just like the remaining modern influence.
Yeah, so I think, like I said, whether or not the Vakil Bazaar was named after the Zands, they played a huge role in designing it. And in many ways, it looks similar today as it did when it was originally designed. But the design of the bazaar itself is used in a lot of other places throughout Persia. And I think one of the big roles that they had was just sort of using Shiraz as a place to attract artists from all over their sort of expanding empire. I think you see that a lot in dynasties, that the capital city becomes a place that like important people want to go to make their mark, to leave their mark. And particularly in Persia, where things like literature and music and architecture and painting are such important parts of the culture, and such important parts of what, leaving a historical legacy has to do with. I think that was a huge thing is in bringing that to Shiraz. And another thing is I don't know if I wrote about it in my article or not, but there are a number of gardens in Shiraz that came about during the Zand dynasty, and I believe some of them are still open to the public today. But the gardens were a huge thing that they really focused on developing, and and that left an impact.
The gardens are so cool. That's something that I hadn't even thought of. And definitely just such a very interesting use of space. And just going back to what you were saying, like the balance that they were able to find behind it, but like with having such a vibrant capital, and then also with the trade is really impressive and kind of shocking. But I guess they also lasted around 50 years. So
Right.
some downfalls of the empire, but it's just so interesting to hear how they were able to maintain that kind of balance during that time.
Right, and just to get all of that going in a 50-year period, I think is pretty impressive that they were able to not only spread over all that space, but to also like, for in the year 2021, like people are still arguing about the bazaar that they created. They like still is standing in Iran.
Yeah, it's definitely so interesting, especially with like the recent history. I guess it's are there any how many like historians or records like of people from men wrote, or is it mostly like outsiders writing about the Zands?
Oh goodness, I have no idea. Most of the stuff that I found were, I found some things from Persian historians, but a lot of it was like Britannica and like outside like experts on Persian history. So yeah, I don't know how many records were actually left by the Zands. Presumably a lot. I mean, it's like the late 1700s. Like they probably had a pretty solid tradition of like keeping written history at that point. So but yeah, I don't know. Maybe some of those sources were inaccessible due to my lack of Persian knowledge. But I'm sure that there were plenty.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's also a decent amount lost to time. I was just kind of curious.
Right. Yeah.
One of the sources probably has the initial name of Akil and where that comes from, but we'll let someone who can
I'm sure.
speak ancient Farsi, or I guess 400 years ago. Incredible. There's really, really cool pieces here, and I love the art, architecture, gardens flourishing. I mean, that's how I think of Shiraz today, and I would not necessarily have connected it to the Zand specifically, just a previous empire. So it's nice to sort of have that clarity of, even if it wasn't only the Zands, that was their capital, and they made this a place to really explode architecturally, gardenally, that's not a word, the design and usage of public gardens and space. That's a really I don't know, that's again a really fascinating emphasis for this empire. Is let's not necessarily fight and gain all this land, as you have said. Instead, let's focus on what we do good, which is architecture, beautiful, design and trade. And Shiraz became that space. So that's, I don't know, that I really like the that is the focus of this empire, and it's interesting because that's a relatively unique one to most of the ones we have. It's generally survival for all of them, but survival, battling and trade. And here it's more of celebrating our peaceful beauty and architectural marvels. I don't know. There's a difference in perspective there that I really enjoy.
Right, almost like sort of taking a deep breath from coming out of so many years of civil war. They were like, maybe they still did do a lot of expansion, but maybe expansion doesn't need to be our main focus, and that, more so we can sort of take a break and just kind of take stock of everything that matters and try and make this capital as beautiful as we can.
They seem to do like a pretty good job just in their ability to like just the trade networks like in itself is just so impressive, and then everything else you've talked about and just how vibrant Shiraz was during that time, it just is so impressive that they were able to accomplish that in such a short amount of time, especially coming from a time of massive conflict right before.
Right, and then the amount of time that they were actually there for many of those things to still be standing, I think is pretty remarkable.
Wow, I mean, what a beautiful sort of sentiment. A deep breath and an appreciation of the natural and built beauty around you is hopefully something a lot of current communities can get to. That's at least my desire here. As we wrap up on this, I guess kind of utopic in a way, community and civilization. Maybe not completely, but at least this thought is nice. I'll take it that much. Any other sort of final pieces or bits you want to share with us about the Zands?
I think we touched on a lot. I think that my main point about it when I was writing the article that I sort of thought about was that it ended all of the civil war that preceded it, that they focused a lot and left a lot of marks in things that are, like you said, different than the sort of traditional battle and trade, but they also left a huge mark in sort of trade with Great Britain. So I think those were the big points I wanted to hit on and my big takeaways from writing this article. So yeah, I think we did a pretty good job.
Well, there we go, 10 out of 10. Yeah, I really enjoyed diving more into them. I mean, there's something to, read the sections, and please do, and go and engage on our website, but actually get sort of the background, your take as the writer, and, now partial global expert on the Zands. At least your byline name is there, so I'll give you that title. Regardless, it's really cool, and that's why I love doing these civilizations, to dive deeper and sort of learn what all of our great writers experienced in this process. So thank you again, Tanner.
Thank you, Tanner.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. So thanks all for listening and tuning in today on the Zands. I hope you can go enjoy a garden and maybe debate the naming of the Vakil Bazaar. Have a fun Reddit deep dive rabbit hole moment. Let us know where the name comes from. And if any of you speak 1700s Persian, there might be records there that showcase it. You can at least get the hyperlinks and the basic research on our website. That's alfusaic.net, alfusaic.net. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.